Heroes of Italian wine allow me to talk to so many fantastic people. Recently, I had a magical experience with Paolo Bea. I'm going to introduce you to Clarke Boehling. He is the producer liaison for Rosenthal Wine Merchant, and the expert on this wine, because I love finding wines that I know very little about, and really when I drink them and have an experience with them, it just opens the floodgates. Now, I have had these wines through in the past, different versions, but I never had this one before. And when I took it out to dinner, I thought it was going to be a white wine because it's Trebbiano. And so I said, okay, let's see. And, it could be interesting. I know the producer is very natural, but this wine obviously has some color implications, oxidation in it. It's really just wild. And so I need to learn more about it. Clarke, you are the expert. Thank you for coming in here and talking to us about this wine. Where are you sitting today?
I'm sitting at our office in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in a little tiny room that's way too brightly lit, and that's why it looks like I'm floating in a middle of the sun.
Well, that's where all wine experts sit, in the middle of the sun. So it's great for you guys to be here and to teach us about this fantastic producer. Um, Tell us about how you got in touch with this wine. How did you become the importer?
There's a very interesting story behind this importer producer relationship, which began a long time ago. So Neil Rosenthal, the founder of our company, started in the late 70s. He was a retailer at the time, and then after a while, he began to travel to Europe to look for his own wineries to import, mostly for the shop. And he started to sell to some restaurants in New York, where we've always been based. Um, he had a relationship with the brother of Daryl Hall from the famous pop soul duo Hall and Oates. And Daryl's brother came by the shop one time with a bottle he had just backpacked home from a trip to Italy and said, "Neil, you must try this." And it was a bottle from Paolo Bea. Uh, Neil tried it and was floored. And so the next opportunity he had on his next trip to Europe, and at that time he was going to Europe 3 or 4 times a year at least, um, he arranged a visit with Paolo's son Giampiero in Montefalco, the little town where they live. And Neil was like 4 hours late to the visit. And at that time, of course, there were no cell phones or anything. So he got there not expecting Giampiero to still be there. He was in the town square just hanging out. Giampiero looks like Brian Ferry from Roxy Music too. He cuts a very distinctive, impressive figure. And so they met and they did a nice long visit, and the rest is history. And Bea quickly became sort of a cornerstone of our book. And, for the past 40 years, has had an incredibly loyal fan base. So yeah, it's been a great history. And, this, as you said, is a skin contact wine, deeply orange in color. But it was really early in that crest of rediscovering orange wines. So this has been made since like the early 2000s, and Bea was at the forefront of that resurrection.
And everything that Bea makes has got that ethos behind it, right?
Absolutely. I mean, what he's really trying to do is to recapture and revitalize a very old way of making wine. Italy in the 80s and 90s was recovering from the war and really put a huge effort into, quote unquote, modernization. So a lot of producers adopted all the bells and whistles of modernization, mechanization. They really wanted to make wine that they knew would be saleable, safe on the shelves, consumable. And, a lot of the wines from that era were sharply in contrast to the sort of rustic traditional wines that had been made in all these areas. And Giampiero, having grown up with his father's deeply artisanal wines, saw that as a big loss. So in the 90s, he founded this group called Vini Veri, which is a well-known consortio of Italian natural wine growers. And his commitment has always been to keeping alive these old traditions. And you've heard of slow food.
Yeah,
Giampiero's style is definitely slow wine.
sure.
as little additives as possible. You know, the only thing he ever adds to his wine is minute amounts of sulfur. They're never fined or filtered. They're never juiced in the cellar in any way. They're never temperature stabilized, and chemicals are never used in the vineyard. So really, it's a way that wine could have been made, 300 years ago, 3,000 years ago, really. So that's really his ethos, and he's deeply committed to it. And he's spread that to a lot of other growers through his work with Vini Veri and mentorships and things like that.
On this picture at the bottom, and I paused to advance to the next slide because is that the Trebbiano grape sitting there, getting some age, or is that a different?
That is some Trebbiano there. So what he does with Arboreus, the wine we're discussing today, is pretty interesting. So in addition to this skin maceration that he does for an extended period of time during the fermentation, he'll also do a tiny percent, maybe 1 to 2% based on the vintage, in pasito style, which means he'll let the Trebbiano dry in natural air flowing rooms on these racks until they get really shriveled. Then he'll make a really highly concentrated wine out of that and add it to the Arboreus for additional layers of complexity. It's like a really subtle addition of a spice or something, but it adds to the texture of the wine for sure and the aromatic spectrum.
Maybe a little out of order here, but just so people know where we're in Umbria, and in particular, is it Montefalco, the town?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Montefalco.
yeah, there's some great wines, and I think Umbria continues to impress me as, like, the quality at the top of the food chain of Umbria can compete with the best wines in the world, and there's some
Absolutely.
really amazing stuff.
I think also, given the proximity to Tuscany, they use some of the same grape varieties for sure. You have a lot of Sangiovese planted there, Trebbiano, but they also have their own distinct varieties like Sorrentino. And I think you see a lot less of that, more commercially minded approach in Umbria. It's still a little bit more agrarian and a little bit more separate from that kind of marketing.
This the winery looks pretty modern. Is this a new facility that was just rebuilt?
Well, Bea actually, Giampiero, that is Paolo's son, is a trained architect, and he's actually a really renowned architect.
Wow.
And he underwent this project, designed the winery from the ground up, basically, I think in around 2008, maybe a little bit before, actually. I think it was right before I started with Rosenthal. But yeah, the whole idea behind the winery is that it consumes as little energy as possible, and it's made all from local materials. So these are all stones, and all the wood and stuff comes from Umbria. He cut the underground part of the cellar above a natural spring. So there's actual water flowing in the cellar, which keeps the humidity level and the coolness pretty constant. And it's stunning. And the way that the winery employs, solar elements and wind elements and everything is just so intricate and so incredibly well thought through. It's really a testament to like Giampiero's combination of localism, but also like his incredible intellect. And I think that's a very particular personality combination that allows him to make these kind of wines, which are both, nodding to the ancient past, but also very self-aware.
Tremendous. And so how long has the winery been in existence? Is this the first or second generation then?
Well, Paolo, I believe his ancestors also made wine here, but for many, many years, it was really more in the model of a lot of Italian families in the past, where, it was a farm where they had their pigs and their other animals and their crops, and wine was just part of that. And they'd make wine for the family. And Apollo is the quintessential Umbrian farmer. And Giampiero is the one who sort of realized, that this artisanal low tech tradition had something to say to the wider world. So he kind of figured out how to bottle and label and present the wines to, a slightly larger audience.
Hmm.
But the family has been making wine for a very long time.
And this is a storied producer. I was talking before we started to record about how, this producers not I you don't always get to taste wines in this business of wine. this wine is so allocated and so hard to get. And so I'm super thrilled to be able to include it in tonight's program. It's something very unique, something very different, something very rare. And now, with, you know, 20 plus years, 30 plus years of it being in your distribution, you guys have elevated it in the minds of wine personalities, because everybody has like an epiphany when they taste these wines. These are wines that just make you go, what am I tasting and what is happening here? And so this is a real special treat. I only get a little bit of this wine. We may sell out of it, and that's okay. We'll be ready to buy it again when it comes back around. But if you like this wine, I would highly encourage you to get involved, potentially even to look out past this wine into the other wines that this producer creates, which we carry a couple. This wine that we're tasting tonight is 100% Trebbiano, and as Clarke was telling us, pretty unique and storied, very historic process. How do we call what? How do we pronounce the name of the wine? Arboreus,
Arboreus is how I always hear Jean Piero pronounce it.
and it.
And he likes to use a lot of Latin in his naming of wines as sort of an additional nod to the genesis of these wine growing areas. But the root of arboreus is the word for tree. And to look at these vineyards is really staggering because, everyone has seen vineyards where the vines are planted in neat rows and trained along little wires and look really clean and perfect. This is truly wild winemaking. I mean, there's a grove of trees in this town called Spoleto, hence the name Trebbiano Spoletino. And these trees are enormous, very old trees. And the vines of Trebbiano, rather than being trained in the manner that we're accustomed to, are just growing right next to the trees, wrapping themselves around the trunks and the branches of these enormous trees. And, Bea doesn't need to prune them. He doesn't need to de-leaf them or anything. It sort of relies on the plant intelligence to get it into position to where the fruit is ripened properly. And of course, the tree acts sort of like a pergola in that it keeps the fruit elevated high above the ground away from pests, and it allows for a lot of air circulation around the fruit as it's ripening. And these vines are very, very old. Some of them are 150 years old. And, it's about as low interference as you can imagine in terms of how he handles the crops.
So I was serious when I took this out, as I thought it was a white wine. It says white wine even on the label, but obviously we look at it and it's a little bit more into the orange category, which this wine kind of predates people calling them orange wines. And it's I brought it into a really amazing restaurant here in Los Angeles, and the sommelier was pretty familiar with it, and she gave me some like explanations for what's happening here. But can you tell us, once the grapes are picked, and then you got these two different lots, you're making a base wine, and then you're adding in that oxidized those clusters that are sitting there in that box that we looked at the beginning, and you're allowing that wine to oxidize. What else are they doing to this wine before bottling?
Well, Bea's goal really is to do as little as possible to the wine in order to get it into bottle. So basically, the grapes are crushed by their natural weight at first to get the fermentation going. And the fermentations here always start naturally and spontaneously. There's never any addition of yeasts, and there's also never any manipulation of the temperature to get it going. Because Bea has such a robust yeast environment in his cellar and on the grapes, because of the way he treats the grapes in the vineyard, fermentations tend to start beautifully. And one of the cool things about his wines is that they're all labeled with a lot of interesting information. So you can see on the label of this 2015, the number 22 there, that's 22 days on the skins. So the wine basically gets a 22-day maceration. And that's not really something he sets out to be exact about. That's just what he feels the wine clocks in at a good amount at. And as the solid materials start to fall through, he realizes that the fermentation is done. And then he allows the wine to settle for an additional 191 days on the gross lees, which is just all the stuff. And that is very different from the way most white or even most orange wine is made. Most producers want to get the wine away from the gross lees as quickly as possible because there's a lot of organic matter and stuff in those gross lees that can potentially, in traditional conventional winemaking, I should say, corrupt the wine. But in ancient times, that is the way that the wine would have been made, just left on all the stuff. And Bea's goal is to get all the stuff that you harvested into the final wine. So he sits it on there for that, better part of a year. And then at that point, he puts it into a tank, and it's a neutral tank, stainless steel, but without like temperature regulation. So it's really just a holding vessel for the juice. And over the course of several years, the wine will settle. And usually, if you're making a white wine to bring to the market pretty quickly, you'll put it in a tank, but then you'll have to filter it as you bottle it because it's going to have stuff floating in it. Bea lets all the stuff settle and lets it reach a nice equilibrium so that he can bottle without any filtration or without any fining. So he wants to have all this stuff in the final product. And in terms of additions, all he adds is a little bit of sulfur. He even puts it on there. I believe it's probably around 50 to 60 milligrams per liter of total sulfur. And that's very little, especially for a wine that's spent several years in élevage. Very little sulfur. And he adds it incrementally. So rather than adding it all at once, he'll do a tiny adjustment here and there if he feels the wine is going a little bit off the rails. And then that also helps the sulfur levels stabilize within the wine and helps you bottle a more stable product at the very end.
Really unique, really different, really special, and carries a price tag around $80 a bottle. And that's a very competitive price, so check it out. But I think it's a wine that now that you've tasted, now that you've seen it, you'll make an opinion about it. We're going to taste it together now, Clarke, with our group. I want to thank you for being uh, our lifeline on this wine to be able to learn more about it. And you're obviously a wealth of information, and I appreciate you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. I really appreciate you asking me to do this, and I hope that everybody gets a lot out of this wine.
We will, and we'll look forward to future Paolo Bea bottlings as well. So have a great day, and thanks very much.
Thank you, and you too.
Be well.
You too. Bye-bye.